Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Masters of the Fly. Before we get going with our guest, James Prosek, we have a striped bass issue that we're all very concerned about, and I'd like to introduce Tom Kaczynski to give us a brief on Amendment 7, and if you go to the chat at the bottom, there'll be a link for you to write your letters and make your comments. Tom.
Thank you, David. Real quickly on Amendment 7. So right now, the Atlantic Marine Fisheries Commission is taking comments on the draft of Amendment 7. Now, this is a 160-page document, so we don't expect anyone to read the whole thing. But what you are able to do at this point is you're able to write a letter to the ASMFC expressing your thoughts and opinions on the draft amendment. The letters are due April 15th, so less than 2 weeks from today. They do not allow form letters. So last time there were over 100 letters disqualified because they were categorized as form letters. So what we've done is we drafted a sample letter on our website, which I'll share in the chat, with how we stand on Amendment 7. But what we encourage you to do is make the letter your own, personalize it. Tell these folks why you care, and those emails have to be sent to comments@asmfc.org by April 15th. We'll put that email in the chat, and if you want to be entered into a raffle to win some really awesome gear from Sims, Costa, various other companies, you could CC stripercomments@gmail.com for a chance to win. So again, this is really important. This is going to shape how striped bass are managed for the next 10 plus years. So now is our chance to make a difference. So get your letters out there, and if you need any help, please reach out to us, but we'll put all the resources in the chat. Thanks, David.
You got it. Thank you very much, Tom. Appreciate it. So Masters of the Fly. Masters of the Fly is really not about mastery, but in a way it is. Masters of the Fly is about a community, a shared love and appreciation for both fly fishing and the outdoors. And that's why Lu Yan, who's not here tonight, he's on a business trip. Tom, Clay, Eric, and I started this venture. Before we get going, there's a few people I'd like to thank. I'd like to thank Trout Unlimited, United Women on the Fly, Dunn Magazine, River Bay Outfitters. Thank you guys so much. Clay, Tom, Eric, you guys have been like stalwarts in this. So moving on. Oh, also I want to thank the planning team. And finally, and I'll remind everybody again later on tonight, May 1st is our Guides Roundtable. And lastly, before we move on, this wonderful bumper sticker here, this Masters of the Fly bumper sticker, anybody who writes into us, we will be happy to mail you one. So get it while you can. All right. James Prosek. James Prosek, I've known James for well over 20 years. James is an artist, a philosopher, a fly angler, not necessarily in that order. James had his debut at 19 years of age. Trout, in illustrated history, and that's Knopf, 1996. If you guys are looking for it, which featured 70 watercolors, about 70 watercolors or paintings of trout of North America. His latest book, Art and Artifice, has been hailed as one of the most important books of art nature in recent history. And James has been, I'll sort of roughly quote the New York Times, has been referred to as a modern day Audubon. So I'd like to introduce James. And of course, Erik Schatzker, our moderator superior, will be taking us through this wonderful interview tonight of both James Prosek of James. So Eric, James, take it away, and I'll be here hanging out with you guys. Thank you.
David, thank you. James, great to see you.
Great to see you guys.
James, before we begin, I want to put a bright line underneath what David said, because this is a community, and we want more people to come to the community, but every community has what I would describe as its rock stars. And I think of you as a rock star. This, James, was, for me, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
I'm a Beatles fan, so that means a lot.
And this was Zeppelin 2. And there's so many more books in your catalog that everyone needs to be aware of, because you don't just paint trout, you've evolved as an artist and a philosopher, as David said, and we're going to get into a lot of that tonight. But I'm going to begin with a simple question that I think will resonate well with our audience. How many fish have you painted?
I was gonna say, I'm just a guy that likes fish. Lord, from the time I started painting birds first as a 4 or 5 year old. My father loved birds, and I would copy birds from Peterson's Field Guide of Birds in North America and Audubon's paintings of the birds in North America. And then, yeah, it was probably around 8 or 9 when I transitioned to fish. And from that point to today, oh boy, I mean, lots of fish. I mean, 1,000, I don't know. How many have I drawn or painted? Innumerable fish. I mean, yeah, lots of fish. That is, if you own one though, they're very special. There aren't that many out there, paintings of fish. No, 1,000 might be a lot. It's really hard to say, Eric, but a lot. I mean, to say that I had an obsession for trout from 9 years old to 22, maybe it was, yeah, is an understatement. I don't know. There's no word to describe the kind of, I guess love is the closest word maybe to describe. I mean, for me, trout as a kid were like my salvation. They were my, I can't even describe it. I can't even recover what it felt like as a 14-year-old, but I just know that when I sat down to draw those fish, it was like out of complete adoration for them. It was like my way of trying to get them under my skin, or I don't know. I can't explain why. And you didn't ask why. You asked how many. So I'll wait for the next question. But
and that, as it happens, James, that is the next question. Why fish? I mean, you just said that you started with birds, but at the age of 9, you became obsessed with trout. And I'll be honest, I was a little older than you were, but I similarly became obsessed.
Yeah.
Trout.
Yeah, fanaticism might be more like it, but that's
and let's acknowledge that at one point in everyone's life, everybody who's listening to us right now is an angler, probably a fly angler, and at one point, and maybe still, let's hope still, because I'm still obsessed, has felt that obsession. But tell us why you became obsessed. Because everyone's story is a good story, and you have taken your story and turned it into a life and a career, for that matter, and a living. But
Yeah.
how did it start?
Well, yeah, birds, there's definitely there are definitely parallels between birds and fish for me. I mean, first of all, feathers and scales overlap in very similar ways, like shingles on a roof, and the birds that my father loved the best, or the most, that I also loved, he grew up in Brazil, and he fell in love with little songbirds down there that are colorful. And the closest equivalent up here were warblers that actually winter in Central and South America. So some of the same birds he saw down there might be the ones that he saw when he moved to New Rochelle, New York, when he was 12. And so he definitely introduced me to nature through his love of birds. And for me, some of the moments warblers are hard to see. They migrate through the best time to see them is before the leaves come on the trees, because they're migrating north and they're eating insects. And once the leaves come on the trees, they're very hard to see, and you have to sort of learn their songs. And trout, similarly, if you don't sort of know something about their habits, you're not going to even see them. I mean, they're gonna
And you're going to have a really hard time catching them.
yeah, they're gonna spook before you even get close to the water. I mean, I came to a place in my teens where I, in the fall, would sneak up to pools on my hands and knees to watch them spawn, and just to dig their little reds, these little native brook trout, and I would just watch them, in the tails of pools, and then I would throw a little fly at them and try to catch them right in the middle of sex, which is not very nice, but but I love to see them in their spawning colors, because that's when they were the most, brilliant. But it was kind of at that age something that was all mine too. I mean, my father fished a little bit, but he didn't really care, and it was like a freedom and independence that I had this thing like fly fishing that I sort of taught myself by watching, a few VHS cassettes of, somebody fly casting, and looking in books like I can't even remember the names now of the guy who wrote this fly tying book that I started tying flies to. But drawing was always a way that helped me go deeper. I think that drawing still survives as a tool because it has helped shape and hone our skills of observation as predators. Whether you're the person that draws the drawing or looks at the drawing, I have a lot of thoughts and theories about why drawing began and why it survives to this day, but a lot of them are linked to predation. And which is not, people might hear the word predator and think bad connotations, but it's in order to, as you said, to catch one of these fish, you have to know them very intimately, and drawing helped me form and forge a more intimate relationship with the fish, because when you draw them, you have to really learn their form and their, how their fins work. And then out on the stream, I would look more carefully at them so that I could draw them better. But for me, the moment, I also had a very strong predatory instinct. I let most of the fish go, but for me, I like to hold things and touch things. I like having a tactile relationship with nature. And when I was a kid, some of the things I remember the most are like, a songbird would fly into the window of our house and die, and my dad would pick it up and put it in my hands, and I would just, like, first of all, it was like weightless. I couldn't believe how light it was, but I would just look at the thing and, like, pet its feathers and then and draw it. And for me, the trout, the moment I really was important for me as a kid was like holding them out of the water and looking at them and then taking a photograph and letting them go. I let go 99% of the fish. Yeah, just I don't remember what your question was, but
No, you're getting there. I want to remind everybody, James, that this is an open Q&A. Folks, please, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'd all love, David, James, and I would love to hear from you. If there are things that you'd like to know from him, please tell us, and I'll work those questions in. And if you want to communicate with him directly, use the raise hand button, and we can probably plug you into this conversation directly, at least if you're on the Zoom link as opposed to Facebook.
Yeah, we can definitely put you on the screen. Yeah.
Now that you said the word communicate, I'll say one more thing about
Please.
I think, I've since that period in my youth when I was obsessed with these fish, I've been trying to kind of ask myself why did I have that passion? Why do I draw? And then why do humans draw, and why do humans fish? And especially if we're letting them go, it doesn't really make sense, in terms of survival. But I think, again, it's linked to an older relationship we had with nature. And it's taken me a long time to kind of come to this realization. And it may seem obvious, but for me, fly fishing is a communication with a non-human animal, which is a very profound and sort of remarkable thing. So if we make an imitation of an insect using fur and feathers tied to a hook, and we think it looks like an insect, and we throw it out into the river, and a fish sort of diverts its sort of normal daily activities to look at that imitation of nature that it thinks looks like an insect, then the brain of a human and the brain of a fish, which we share common ancestry with 400 million years ago, roughly, we think, our brains are connecting over this translation device, which is a fly, but the translation device is a representation of nature. It's not actual nature. So it's made me realize that most of our, if not all of our communication is through representations. So I also, when I make work and show it in a book or a gallery, I'm trying to communicate my love of these fish through a representation. It's not the actual fish. It's like a map that we use to navigate the world and not the actual world. Just like words, I think part of my fascination with words is that they're representations of the world using the materials of something else. So a mark on a paper can represent a word like tree, which is a gross reduction of all the trees in the world, but it works for communication, just like the word tree is a representation of something using sound, just like a fishing fly is a representation of something using fur and feather.
And the paintings themselves are representations of the fish that you love.
Yeah, so I realized only like 2 or 3 years ago that there are these really strong parallels between my love of drawing the fish and my love of catching the fish, because they're both about some kind of increasing or developing some kind of intimacy that you wouldn't have had with the world had you not tried to communicate through representations. So a duck decoy.
I'm going to ask you to pause for 1 second, because while we're talking about representation and while we're talking about your artwork, I think it makes sense, Tom, if we could pull up the first painting that we want to show everybody. And for those who are not familiar with James's work, or at least have connected his name with paintings of fish, this should ring a bell immediately. And James, just to remind everybody, or perhaps to remind you as well as me, we're going to loosely, construct this conversation around 3 of your paintings. And this is the first, the marble trout. This is a pretty extraordinary painting, for sure. It also happens to be a pretty extraordinary fish. And I want you to continue talking about representation, and then I'd really like to get into some of the passion, the motivation, the adventure that drove you to find this animal.
Yeah, well, the part of what's amazing about communicating through representation is that sometimes the representation can communicate things better sometimes when it's not accurate, which we find with fly fishing. Like sometimes a fly that doesn't have to exactly match what it's supposed to be.
The royal wolf, right?
What's that?
What is the royal wolf? What does
Right,
that match?
right. So yeah, and or a fur ball you find in the corner of your house tied to a hook might work better than anything else, but I think about that with words sometimes, because when I started sort of a lifelong inquiry about naming nature and how we have to take an interconnected, constantly changing nature and fragment it, cut it up and label the pieces in order to, I was like, what a disservice, it's like a murderous thing we do. We chop nature into pieces, and when really it's this holistic, interconnected, constantly changing thing. But now I'm like, it's a necessary process. And sometimes when a tool is not perfect, it's better because it allows for these kind of beautiful mistakes and misunderstandings and that we learn from, and I think makes our brain stronger. But I can talk more specifically about the marble trout if you want me to.
Yeah. Well, let's, because I think it's a great analogy for what you do. You don't, I mean, you started painting fish long before Google ever existed, but it's not like you do a Google search and start to paint off the screen. These are fish that you go and find yourself, right?
If I'd had Google back then, I would have, because I was using every resource I could find. I mean, first it started with, I was 9 years old and I couldn't find a book in the library about the trout in North America. So I was like, well, I'll just make my own, because my dad was always like, well, you can learn anything in the library. And I was like, but the book's not there. So I have to. So I started writing letters to departments of wildlife around the country, and I got very nice responses from, biologists who'd studied particular types of trout, the Humboldt trout from Nevada deserts, or,
This just to be clear, this is back in the 80s, right?
This is before the internet. Yeah, this would have been I was born in 75, so around 1984. I'm writing handwritten letters saying I'm this kid, I want to paint the trout in North America, and I don't think there's anybody that didn't respond. I mean, it was such a lovely kind of process, and I developed relationships with some of these people as friends. There was a guy named Fred Kirchis who worked for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, or whatever it's called, in Maine, and he studied these rare Arctic char, these relict species of Arctic char that survived the last glaciation in the lakes, and they call it the blueback trout or the sunapee trout, but they're just landlocked Arctic char, but they're very beautiful. And ended up, once I had a driver's license at 16, going up to visit him and going out in these lakes to do surveys with gill nets and stuff. But anyway, it was just a great experience. But one of the things I learned is that no two of these biologists could agree on how many species of trout there were. And not only that, they couldn't agree on what a species even was. So I'd grown up with these field guides where there's a picture of a bird and a name. And I realized that was sort of a fiction, that because nature is fluid and constantly changing, and really a continuum, if things evolve on a continuum, we have to make a decision where to draw lines in that continuum and what units to name. But it gives a false impression of what nature is like, because it's not about a bunch of units that fit in boxes. It's just like with the color spectrum, we've named different segments called red or orange or yellow. Those aren't real things. They're pieces that we choose where to draw the lines in the spectrum and where to label things. So I learned that a lot of us, and I still do, of course, live in maps. We don't live in the actual world. So what I tried to do is, by traveling around to see these fish, was try to get closer to the reduction that we live in, and the only way I could do that, really, the truest possible way, was to catch an individual fish or several, witness what they actually look like. But I preferred seeing them out of the water, because underwater they're camouflaged, But when they're in our world and they're sparkling in the sun, they're just these, to me, one of the most beautiful things on the planet. So but it's capturing. You show that marble trout, and I'm thinking, to capture that moment when they first leave the water and they're still alive, and they fade very quickly. Anybody who's caught a fish and kept it to eat knows that the colors fade very quickly after they die or as they're dying. So it was a moment that you can't capture with a camera or your memory.
You had to see it for yourself.
It was something you had to see. And I did paint some from pictures other people took, or some of the fish were extinct and only survived in descriptions in old books. Like my Bible was this book, American Food and Game Fishes, by David Starr Jordan and Walter Everman. Jordan was a really interesting character. He was the first president of Stanford University. It also turns out more recently that he was like one of the leaders of the eugenics movement. So it's like now he's a terrible person, but this was my, before I found this out, he was sort of like one of my heroes, as was Audubon. A lot of these people are, had mixed, well, that's a more complicated conversation, but in any case, yeah, it that whole process raised a lot of questions about, for me, about how do you capture the ineffability of something. Like, you can't capture it. It's just an interpretation, just like a word is, just like, but if we mistake, like, the thing that brought me to the language sort of inquiry is that, like, if we use language and forget that it's a tool, then we're really missing out on something, like the unmediated experiences where we're not living through a tool like language. And that's what you can achieve through fishing. You're having this kind of, it is mediated because it's through the lure or the fly, which is the communication device, but I've never been in nature as much, or felt that I was part of it as much, as when I was a kid on a stream. And I'm not sure I'll ever get back to that kind of level of intimacy that I had at that age, for whatever multiple reasons. But in any case, sorry.
No, it's please, it's all good. When you started to travel around the world looking for these various species of salmonids, I want you to give us a window into what that was like, and we'll bring back the marble trout again, just to help tell these kinds of stories. Because,
well,
James, to be clear, what you did as a young man is what every trout fanatic, and for that matter, many fly anglers around the world dream of doing, which is to go and find these incredible fish in their native habitats. Tell us the story of how you ended up going. I know there's some interesting details to it. This fellow Johannes, and your
Johannes,
7-year odyssey, and give us some of that flavor.
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate. I mean, and it was all because, I sent out 10 proposals as a freshman in college to do a book on the trout of North America, and a publisher picked it up, and it came out, and it did well enough that I thought, well, maybe I can keep doing this. And I was like, well, I did the North American trout to the best of my abilities, and then I started learning, well, there are fishes of that family that you use that word, salmonid fish, salmon, trout, char, the common names we use, which are also misleading because they predate genetic research, where we actually learned that brown trout and Atlantic salmon are most closely related. Rainbow trout and Pacific salmon are most closely related. The fish we call trout are not that closely related. So it's a big mess, but it's a fun mess. In any case, it started with actually, I was, as an English major in college, I was reading Paradise Lost, and I really loved John Milton, but I was also still obsessed with fishing. So anytime a reference to a river or stream came up, I would start daydreaming about. So Milton writes about the headwaters of the Tigris River bubbling forth near the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. And I thought, well, how cool would it be to go to the headwaters of the Tigris, where Eden was historically, and catch the trout that lived in Eden? Because of course, God chose a fate for all the animals on the earth that favored fish, because it was a flood. So the fish didn't die. I mean, Noah didn't need to bring tanks full of fish and aquariums on the ark because they were in the water, right? So I think God favored fish. In the biblical story, I don't adhere to any particular kind of faith, but in any case, so I applied to some travel fellowships to try to go to Southeast Turkey when I was in college to look for trout in the headwaters of the Tigris, because I didn't even know if there were trout there. And they didn't give me the fellowship because they thought it'd be too dangerous, because the Turkish, military fighting the Kurdish separatists there. And so, but after I graduated, I did end up going there with this crazy Austrian guy named Johannes Schuffman, who I'd written to. None of my stories are short, I'm sorry, but I'd written to this guy Robert Benke, who was sort of the world expert on trout, and I'd been corresponding with him for a while at that point. And I said, do you know of anybody who has caught trout in Eastern Turkey? And he said, yeah, this Austrian businessman has been writing me letters with pictures he's taken of fish. And so I wrote this guy Johannes, and he said, why don't you come to Austria and meet me at my home? And so I did, and we and we put together a trip for the following summer to go look for trout in the headwaters of the Tigris. So we drove from Austria to northern Italy, took a ferry to Greece, and we drove all the way through Greece to about 30 kilometers from the Iraqi border in southeast Turkey. And it became so difficult because every 60 to 100 kilometers, there was a military checkpoint. They would stop our car, take everything out of the car, a bunch of 18-year-olds with, pretty big guns. And they'd be like, what are you doing here? And we'd say alabalık, which is the word for trout in Turkish. And they'd look at our passports, and then they'd let us go through, and we give them cigarettes and stuff to keep them happy. And so we didn't find the trout in the Tigris on that trip, but we did catch trout in the Euphrates headwaters. But there were, I was just a stupid kid in my early 20s, and at that point, and I didn't particularly register that there were dangers, in doing some of these things. We flew in terrible aircrafts in different places, and places like Mongolia have changed a lot since 1998 when we went there, or Armenia. I mean, these countries that were part of the Soviet Union were just coming out of being communist for, however long, and they were trying to transition to democracy. It was fascinating. I mean, there were people like begging for food everywhere. Like it was just like, it was like Armageddon. I mean, I realize now that period of time in the late 90s was very special because it was before the internet and cell phones. There were people using like what I would say were 19th century or even 18th century farming tools in Kyrgyzstan or Armenia, handmade wooden. I wish I could have brought some home. They were beautiful. Cutting hay with scythes, sharpening with stones, stacking them up. It looked like a Monet painting or something. It was just
while you're traveling around with a graphite fly rod.
Right. And in places, almost universally, we would be, if there was a village nearby, all the kids would come down to the river to see what we were doing, and they would take off their clothes and jump in the pool where we were fishing. So it made it very hard to find fish sometimes, but oftentimes, because already these habitats were severely degraded, we had to go up into the very high headwaters. There are so many, to me, interesting trips, and I did chronicle a bunch of them in this book, Fly Fishing the 41st Parallel, and Trout of the World, which was the paintings of the trout. But we went to Kyrgyzstan to try to find brown trout. The easternmost native brown trout live in the Pamir Mountains and near the border with Afghanistan and in Kyrgyzstan, and also in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan was hard to get into. We thought about it, but didn't eventually, but ultimately. But anyway, we were looking for trout in this headwater called the Kitsel Sioux River near Uzbekistan, and it's very rugged country, and these streams are like torrents. I mean, it's not habitat you would think of brown trout living in, like crazy white water, and it was like, how are we going to catch fish here? And these kids come out and like with like a hand line and like put some insects from, they'd walk around with stoneflies in their mouth, and they'd take one out and put it in the hook and drop it down under one of these boulders and just let it sort of sit around there. And in those eddies under those rocks and that crazy, there were fish down there. And but we were staying at I don't know, it was probably, these fish were living at like 12,000 feet, which is higher than any native trout in North America. The highest elevation native trout in North America are maybe 9 or 10,000 feet. We've introduced them to higher elevation lakes by just putting them up there. But anyway, it was we stayed at the base camp for this. People were climbing Peak Lenin, which is the highest mountain in the Pamir range. I think it's 20-something thousand feet. It's a high peak, but anyway, I could go on for hours, and
Tell us. I'm going to ask Tom to bring up the striped bass, because I want to know how you got interested, given given this incredible legacy that you have with trout. And truly, James, it is a legacy. Anybody who's captivated by the beauty of trout and has looked around for something to capture that beauty has seen your work. How did you get interested in saltwater fish?
Well, I painted after the trout of Europe, Asia, North Africa, I kind of ran out of trout. So I'd always, I grew up in Connecticut fishing Long Island Sound. So I was actually caught bluefish before I'd ever caught a trout. Striped bass in the 80s were very scarce. So it was like, my uncle caught a striped bass one day on a umbrella rig. I used to go out in this Boston whaler with him, and he'd tow this terrible umbrella rig around on wire line. And one day I was striped bass, and it was like catching a unicorn. I don't know, like maybe we weren't doing the right thing, but
David can tell us what it was like back then.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh.
I think they were pretty scarce, but
I tell you what, I mean, even spending many of my summers on Martha's Vineyard, I can tell you, I don't think I saw a striped bass till I was in college in the early to mid 80s, and then I didn't see, and that was during the moratorium, but I don't think I caught a striper on the east end of Long Island until the mid to late 80s. It was
yeah,
tough.
yeah. I mean, what a comeback. It's just, but like you guys, by I guess the early 90s, my second book was about my friendship with a game warden who caught me fishing illegally when I was 14 in a reservoir, near drinking water reservoir. And Joe Haynes, this game warden, he really reintroduced me to saltwater fishing in Long Island Sound. And we would go surf casting at night with plugs, redfin minnows, and with lots of treble hooks. And
Hey James, I want to shamelessly plug that book because it's one of my favorite books you've ever written.
what's
So,
that, David?
The
Well,
one
Joe and Me.
Yeah,
thank you.
Joe and Me is such a great book.
That was about a love for an individual who shared this sort of these strange predatory pastimes, and he introduced me to ice fishing and more sort of hunting. And we had a lot of he didn't understand that I let fish go, so he fished for the pot, he said, and you're like, why would you let food go back in the water? So, and I would be like, well, I like to let them go because I want them to live. And but when I went fishing by myself for stripers in the surf, if I caught a keeper, I would bring it back to Joe, just because it was like a kind of honoring his whatever. But yeah, so I think striped bass is one of the most beautiful fish, and they're
gorgeous, aren't they?
Yeah.
Iridescent in the
And
most
they're
subtle
beautiful.
way.
You know what, Eric? There's one question that's just standing out at me. If you could just address it, and that's from Annie Novak. Would you like to read it? It's just such an awesome, question.
Yeah, I'm going to read it in full, as a matter of fact. So this is what Annie writes, James. I've seen some of James's work in person. It's so lovely. And I was struck by his mixed use of selected subtle elements of iridescent paint on objects like shells and, of course, some of the fish. It captures exactly what he described earlier as the unphotographable color that fades when the fish dies. And it makes the paintings a lot of fun to see in person. Here's the question. Is this a pigment powder he mixes, or is the paint as applied? And I'd be delighted to hear about the painting process generally, including what you use in the field versus in the studio or while traveling. Why use a particular medium over another, e.g. watercolor versus tempera? But I know it's not a question about fishing, she says.
Yeah.
So tackle it briefly.
Well, since I'm in my studio, I can show you instead of just tell you.
Perfect.
If I can find my So I use a powdered mica. Can you see it on my finger?
Hmm.
It's like they use it in I think it's made for the cosmetic business. They put it in, when kids go to prom or whatever, and they glitter themselves off war paint, and I take a water soluble urethane, which is basically like an acrylic medium, and I mix the mica powder with the urethane, and I basically slather it on the paper. But well, there's different ways I use it. I also mix it with watercolor, but with the ocean fish, I found this guy in Brooklyn named Robert Doak, who made his own watercolor paints, and I hope he's still alive. I mean, he was in his 70s or 80s, maybe 10 years ago. So I bought so much of his paints that I haven't contacted him recently, but he was like, he'd get on the phone with me. He had this great New York accent. He'd be like, I got powdered mic in my computer. He'd be like, he'd get in these conversations with me, like, what are you painting? What are you trying to paint? And I was like, well, I'm painting these big ocean fish. I was working on like a big swordfish, a life-size swordfish that I saw harpooned. And
Tom, bring up the swordfish.
oh, we have the swordfish. So
We have the swordfish. Indeed, we
talk
do.
about trying to capture a fish. This was like, I mean, one of the most incredible things I've ever seen in my life. Really, I mean, it was almost like it was a divine moment for me. And I've talked to the people who were on the boat at the time since then, and well, I could talk for hours about this fish, but and I'll get back to the mica because this is a mica heavy painting. But for a couple of years I was trying to get on a swordfish harpoon boat, and swordfish harpooning only really was happening in a small area in George's Bank, off of east of Massachusetts, south of Nova Scotia. George's Bank has been sort of, I think, the fishing rights cut in half between Canada and the United States. So I was introduced to a little group of a small harpoon fleet out of Woods Harbor, Nova Scotia, southern Nova Scotia. So I drove up there one summer. I had made great sort of, it took a while to make a connection, and I did through a friend who had a friend who worked at Boston Sword and Tuna, and he talked with, these commercial fishermen don't want just any old yokel out on their boat, because it's not only their livelihood, it's a serious business, and they're out there for days. You could get hurt.
Yeah.
You could get sick, and they'd have to turn around. So finally, somebody agreed to take me on a harpoon boat. I drove up to Woods Harbor, Nova Scotia. I went out on the dock. I got a sort of a grilling from the guy who is the overseer of the whole business. This guy, Almond Mood, his name was, and he had to kind of like, I felt like I was being sort of interviewed, like, you're not some sort of, conservationist trying to like out us on something. You're not going to observe something you're going to report about. Anyway, I ended up going with a boat, not the boat that I went up there to go out on, but I was just hanging out on the docks, and this boat came in, and they were unloading 13 dead swordfish. They'd been out for 7 days. And I was like, I saw the guy who I thought was probably the captain, and I was like, I didn't somehow get up the guts to talk to him, but he saw me there looking at the fish, and he's like, so what are you doing? And I said, well, I just drove up from Connecticut. It took me like 22 hours to see a swordfish in its living colors, because I want to paint it life size. And for this project I'm doing, painting, a bunch of Atlantic fishes life size, not just a fish to represent all swordfish, but an individual fish that I had a personal experience with. And he said, well, you've never seen a color blue on land like the color of a swordfish. He said, if you ever met a girl with the eyes the color of a swordfish, you'd leave whoever you were with and go with her. And he had this whole like thing about this, the colors of a living swordfish. And he said, well, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, nothing. I was going to go out on this other boat. And he's like, well, we're spending one night at home, and then we're going out again tomorrow if you want to come with us. So I went out with these guys, and they were incredible people, incredible predators. I mean, they could watch the water for 12 hours a day, I swear, and not take their eyes off the water. I mean, they just crazy humans, and what they're looking for is the dorsal fin and the back of the tail fin of the swordfish, because there's this complicated sort of reason why you can harpoon swordfish there. You can't just go harpooning anywhere. The surface temperature of the water in the summer needs to be very cold, because swordfish they feed down 2,000-3,000 feet, and then they have to come up to like warmer water. Usually most places they can come up 10-15 feet to warm up some mechanism in their brain that sharpens their vision again, so they can go back down and feed it squid and stuff really deep. So if the surface temperature of the water is really cold, they can't just come up to 10 feet. They have to come all the way to the surface and expose their heads directly to the sun. And that's why they can spot them up there and actually throw a spear at them. And that's what they're doing. It's a really very old way to catch a fish. So we went out and I saw this fish, and they harpoon the fish, and then they let it's on a rope. The harpoon head's attached to a rope and a buoy. So they let it sort of die before it comes on the boat. And sorry, I'll get to the point in a minute. But so most of the fish, because you can't bring a live swordfish on the boat because it's got a spear on its head, it could kill somebody. So they come on board usually this coppery bronze color, but you can see them free swimming. It's one of the only places in the world where you can see a free swimming swordfish. So you can see the colors, but it's still underwater, before they throw the spear on it. And they are like purple blue on the top. It's an incredible color. But then the captain said, 1 out of 100 fish or something will flash back to its living colors on the deck right before it dies. So all these coppery, we caught, I think, 12 or 13 fish on that trip. On the last day, or the second to last day, it got very stormy, and all the rest of the crew wanted to go back. The captain's like, he was one of those, Ahab kind of guys, like, no, we're staying out. I was like, holy shit, I'm so sick. Like, please, let's go in. But on that day, and it's harder to spot the fish if there's like, 8-foot waves or whatever. So, and it's not a huge boat, but anyway, so we stayed out, and the next day they spotted a fish and harpooned this fish and got on the boat. It came on this coppery bronze color, and then all of a sudden I hear this shouting like, James, come see this, because they knew I wanted to see this. And this fish flashed back to these living colors, like on the deck of the boat, silver body, blue, crazy blue, purple back. And then between the silver and the blue, I don't know if you can see, there's this jagged line like dripping paint. And in any depiction of a swordfish, you will see a straight line going right across, but that's not what they look like. Because I realized that nobody who's ever drawn a swordfish has probably actually seen this, because it is almost like so rare to see this, like to bring, a 12 or 14 foot fish on the deck of a boat and have it flash back to its living colors. It's just not something you can see, because you can see a fish that's been dead for 10 hours, but to see an actual live swordfish is a very special thing. So then to capture it is another thing. And it also has these weird ridges on the back, on the sides, that as it's leaner in certain times of the year, they're like stretch marks. They're kind of like these ridges. And as they get fatter, they disappear more. But there's all kinds of, and the eyeball, I mean, I couldn't get enough of this eyeball. This huge eye. And so this fish, I slathered that mica stuff. I did a whole undercoat of powdered mica so that the fish, the depiction would be sort of bright and silvery, but the swordfish looking in the eye taught me something that was very sort of revelatory to me. Every time when I was a kid, I would paint a trout, I would save the eyeball for last. And then when I finished the eye, I would put a little white dot on the eye, like a highlight on the eye. And for me, like the whole thing would sort of come alive. Without that little highlight, it was very different. It was to me remarkable what happened when you put that little white thing on and I never really thought about what that little highlight was until I looked in the eyeball of this swordfish, and I could see my own reflection, all the rigging in the boat and the crow's nest or whatever they call it, the big mast where they spot the fish from. And then I saw in the eyeball of the swordfish a reflection of the sun, like, and I was like, that's dummy, that's what it is. It's the sun. That the sun is our reference point to everything. It's why we're here. And maybe that's why it means something in our little brains when we see that little highlight. But anyway, it was it was a cool experience. But you just can't represent these things. Also, like, I couldn't draw out there. It's so wet. The everything's soaked with salt and water. You know, you're just, I mean, you can barely take out a piece of paper and write anything down because everything's so just humid and drenched. So I took a lot of pictures and I made some notes and I did do some little sketches, but part of it was just the memory of being there, you know.
And this was, I actually, I can't say that I've had the pleasure of going to an exhibit where this picture was displayed, but you mentioned earlier, and I've seen some video of this. This is a life-size piece, right? And so was your painting of the great white shark and a number of other big Atlantic species, right?
Yeah, I mean, the idea was that these were sort of portraits of experiences with individual fish. So this fish also had these very weird markings behind the head, like these X-like. If it was larger, you could see. And I would paint all the scars and scabs because these are individual fish that had their own experiences in the water. They'll have fights with things. Something will try to eat them. Maybe they have weird mating rituals where they're fighting. I didn't want to erase those personal marks because they're sort of like residue of their own experiences in the ocean. But they're also pictures of me because they're about my experience with these fish. And if I saw like my rain jacket reflected in the fish, I wouldn't take that away because I didn't want to erase, although I'm erasing a lot of reality, or because it's isolated on the page, but and the elements underneath, I always chose, they're things that live in the ecosystem of the particular fish. But I liked in this case how the horseshoe crab tail sort of mimics they're sort of my own little taxonomy, my own little classification system that's completely nonsensical, but really when it comes down to it, all classification systems are really arbitrary.
And this one happens to be deeply personal to you.
All these paintings are deeply personal to me. Yeah.
James, there's a question here that I think is highly relevant to what you were just talking about, particularly the individuality of the fish that you're trying to capture. Richard Fleming says, for whenever it might fit, to what extent is scientific illustration art? And he adds, my daughter is an artist who does scientific illustration in the mix. So we've talked, and I guess he's trying to understand for himself, looking at what you do, looking at what she does, are they all part of a continuum? Because the scientific illustrator is trying to do presumably almost the antithesis of what you're trying to do, which is come up with the archetypal image as opposed to the individual.
Well, I think all these ways of trying to represent our experience as humans in the world, our interaction with nature, they're all important. And if we all did it the same way, it wouldn't be as interesting. Science, my little sort of thing about science versus art and what's the difference. First of all, these are just more arbitrary classifications, right? Separating art from science. There's a lot they share in common, but science is, or has been in the past, largely about taking the holistic continuum and chopping it into pieces. We study the human body, we study parts of the human body, you specialize in the brain or the heart or whatever, hoping that when those different parts that we study separately are put together, that you get the whole again. but the whole is something very elusive. It's not the sum of the parts. It's something different than the sum of the parts. I think that it's possible through, as the resolution of our observations becomes finer, that we might get closer to something of the holism in the world. But I don't think we'll ever understand all the complex interactions that happen, let's say, in an ecosystem in your backyard. There's no way. I mean, there's no way. I don't think we'll ever understand what consciousness is or how that ever came to be. Humans being able to, self-awareness or something that crazy. It's just like, how did that happen? And what is it? And, it's beautiful, but it's also really difficult to live with sometimes. But so I think that art, though, tries to probe or document the elusiveness of experience, which science doesn't do. Science, a scientific paper about a marble trout wouldn't be about how you got there or how dangerous the trip was or the adventures you had. It's just about the features of the fish, the anatomy, the
habitat, right?
Supposedly objective observations of its behavior. That's a valuable and important thing. I've always been more interested in trying to capture, and never thought about it, but that elusiveness of experience and what that, not that scientists aren't either. I mean, I've traveled a lot with scientists, and one trip I made for the book I'm writing about, Naming Nature, to Suriname in South America, this former Dutch colony, to look for undescribed species of birds. And if you want to find an animal that hasn't been named, you try to go to a place where people don't live, because then there's no names on things. And central Suriname happens to be pretty remote. So, that was the beginning of a lot of travels with a very close friend, my friend Christoph Ziskowski, who's the ornithology collections manager at the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale. And Christoph would see me painting on the trip, and we were collecting birds, so we had a lot of dead material around. So I'd take a dead toucan and start drawing it, and he'd be like, "Why are you painting it dead?" He's like, "Why don't you paint it like as it's alive on a branch?" And I'm like, "Because I'm painting what we're doing. I'm painting my own experience, which is about killing and collecting and naming. In order to name these things, you have to bring a specimen home. So I'm interested in that process of needing to take something's life in order for it to exist in our knowledge system in Western science. Now we're coming to accept other stories and worldviews, you might call them, and mixing them with Western science. People are a lot more open now to engaging with indigenous practices, or, I'm working on a project about prairies at a museum in Fort Worth, Texas. And a lot of what I've been reading is about learning about how indigenous people use fire to catalyze growth in the prairies, that trauma and disruptions in nature, the right kinds, can actually produce more abundance. So I think we're at a place where, I think all these different ways of depicting things are important. We need people who are making field guides and reductions of creatures, because they help us as the map. We need many different kinds of maps to navigate. So they're all important. And I would say that my goal as a kid was to paint these fish accurately, but I don't feel like they came out that way. I look at those paintings I made when I was, in my late teens, and they look very folky, and they're not. I was trying to achieve accuracy. I mean, I really was. But in any case, I value all these forms of representation. They're all very.
I do want to point
Eric.
out, James, that for those who don't know, he does a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
There's one
James,
example.
James, we're on the 9 o'clock hour, and I want to say, if
Other-
you've got time, if you, I love that.
I happen to be a little bit of a collector, as you can
I
see.
didn't know. I don't know where you got that stuff, but I'm happy to give you more.
You know, the one we don't have is the parrotfish, which I'm in love with, because you were talking about birds and fish, and you've melded that into one of your paintings years ago that I had the pleasure of looking at. But we're on the 9 o'clock hour, and if you've got a little extra time, James, I'd love us to continue for a few more minutes. Is that all right?
Yeah, people want to, sure.
Absolutely.
James, there's a great question here from a gentleman who's supplied us with some great questions before, Peter Suska. He by the way, he has read Joe and Me.
Oh,
He says it was a great read, and of course, he's absolutely right that so many of us who took up fly fishing had a mentor or an influence
Yeah.
that, or some kind of force that that brought us there. I certainly had one. Here's his question. There's such a great relationship between seabirds and saltwater game fish and their prey. I've never seen a book on that. And I guess he's trying to put you up to that, because we've all seen that, right? That moment where the
it's
birds
crazy.
are blitzing and the fish are blitzing, and it's incredible. And he's right. It does beg to be documented.
Well, I, as many of us, I think what captivated me as a kid is it's what happens at the surface. You know, that's everything, because that's our world. And the film between land and sea, or air and water, it's in one sense a real, and this could be seen as an allegory for some of the other things I'm interested in. It's a real line. It is. I mean, if we jumped in the water and we went down and didn't have any kind of breathing apparatus to help us, we would die. You know, if we bring a fish out and it's gasping for breath, for air, it's going to die. But in another sense, there's this incredible exchange between the air and water. I mean, or the land and the sea, the coast we look at as this sort of line. But I'm interested in those exchanges, like you were just talking about with the birds and the fish. I mean, it's almost as if they're communicating. And I've seen in other parts of the world, I remember in a trip to the Amazon, seeing these fish drive bait fish up onto the bank. And we've seen this in probably Long Island Sound too. And the birds are sitting there waiting on the bank to eat the predatory fish are basically herding everything for the birds to eat. And I'm not sure if it's mutualistic, if the birds do anything that gives back to the fish, but I'm sure there's something there. But that is an incredible engagement that blurs the line between air and water. And a creature that I became very fascinated with and spent 12 years writing a book about is the American eel, which blurs the line between the land and the sea, because it spawns out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in this region east of Bermuda, the Sargasso Sea, and then it spends its adult lives in freshwater systems. Historically, every stream draining the Atlantic Ocean, including the tributaries of the Mississippi, all the way up the Missouri, into the Midwest, these things historically went. And they're exchanging biomass between the land and the sea. So they spend 10 to 30 years in fresh water, living off the insects and the whatever they can eat, other fish. And then they're taking that biomass and transferring out to the ocean when they spawn. And it's this, you look at the beach and you're like, well, there's this line here. But really, if you look at it another way, the rivers are feeding the ocean, the ocean's feeding the rivers. It's through migratory fish, through rainwater, through whatever the circulatory system is doing. But it's an interconnected. So I think we have worlds we have division and separation in nature, but when you pull back, it's also there's nothing new in what I'm saying. It's the whole earth is this organism, right? But
It's
yeah,
all connected.
I
Connected. Yep.
and you see those videos of gannets and stuff diving down and feeding in balls of bait with sailfish. It's just like, what? This is crazy. But it's one of the most magnificent things when you see it, right? I mean, you guys have all seen it. That was when before I really loved fishing at 9, I would go out with my uncle on his Boston whaler, and we'd tow those umbrella rigs around. But if we saw a ball of bait or something, or birds, he was always looking for the birds, and we would go up to the birds and we would cast, so yeah, it's those moments are very special, as we all know.
Tell us,
Same with when there's a hatch on a stream, the birds are eating the insects, the swallows, the trout are coming up, it's that the hatch.
There's a symbiosis there.
Yeah, and that the hatch is what is, an organism is transitioning from an aquatic animal to an animal that lives in the air, which is pretty remarkable, like a mayfly. And there are things feeding as it's coming up, there are things feeding at the surface, and there are things feeding when it's up in the air, and then there's things feeding when they come back down and are dead on the surface of the water. So as fishermen, we get to see things that nobody else sees. And if I'm allowed, I'll give one. Can I tell one quick little story that's
Bring it on.
Then there was a guy, he's probably still alive, Kenny Abrams, and some of you may know these long, beautiful flies he makes for striped bass. A lot of his fishing was about making short casts and rips and just letting the fly kind of do its own thing, like maybe wasn't even trying to imitate anything in particular. But he was a very and he may be still alive, so he may be and is, but I haven't talked to him in a while. But we were out fishing one night in Rhode Island and off the beach, and he started talking to me about, why, again, in the biblical story of, Jesus coming down to the Sea of Galilee and seeing the apostles, or, the apostles were fishermen. And he's like, there's a reason why Jesus chose to go to fishermen and show his miracles to fishermen, because if he went to somebody in a city and, walked on water or something, they might think it's a party trick or something. But if he goes out to a bunch of commercial fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, and they haven't caught a fish in 30 days, and this stranger comes up to them and says, throw your nets on the other side of the boat, and they're like, who's he? And they do it, and they catch a net load of fish. I mean, these are people who see the sun come up every day, the sun go down. They know their environment as intimately as anybody. And if there's an aberration that's that extreme, they know that this person is something special. Or so Kenny was saying, which I think makes a lot of sense, that he chose fishermen because fishermen are extremely acute observers of their environments, and they knew that when something that strange happens, that it was a miracle. It wasn't just somebody playing a trick on them or something. So I think there's some value to that. Then fishermen also, I wrote my senior thesis on Isaac Walton and the Complete Angler, and he wrote about how fishermen are simple, humble people who follow peace. And he was kind of, the Complete Angler's code for the complete Anglican. And it's sort of a religious civil war. The English Civil War was raging, and the Anglicans were being pushed out of London by the Cromwellians, and it was really his book about what he thought it was to be a good Christian. But yeah, fishermen, I think, are pretty good people. We're because we spend time out in nature, and we have a connection that we value with it, maybe. Anyway,
You know what,
sorry about that.
Erik? I think this is a really good coda for tonight and what James just said. And if you want to ask him one quick thing, that'd be great. But otherwise, I think I'm going to finish the session because
I do have one question.
Yeah.
I do. Of course, I have a million questions, but but with respect to everybody's time and to your times as well, James.
I'm fine, but you know, people might want to go to bed, but they have the
No,
luxury.
but
Turning off
what
the
I'm
computer.
thinking, what I'm thinking is that people might want to have a little more visibility into what you're doing. Yes, they can go out and buy Trout. They can go and buy Trout of the World. They can go buy Joe and Me. They can go buy the 41st. They can go and buy all your books. But if they want to see what you're doing now, where's the best place for them to go? Do you have an exhibition coming up? Do you have?
Well, I do have an exhibition opening in May in Tribeca at my dealer's space. So I could share stuff with you that maybe you could post if you want on your.
Yeah, we'll put it on the MOF website. Absolutely.
I have a show I'm part of at the Sun Valley Museum of Art in Idaho, which opens late in summer. Anybody who's out there, I have a show I'm part of that opens at the Brandywine River Museum in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania in September. And then next fall of 2023, I'm working on a show, this prairie related show at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, Texas. But yeah, there may be other.
And George, my good friend George McAuliffe asks, do you have where should we direct people's traffic? Do you have a website? Do you have a blog?
Yes, so my website is currently like 2 years out of date, but it should be updated like in another 2 months or something. But I usually do post stuff on Instagram.
What is it?
My website is out of date. I said.
No, what is it? Is it jamesprosek.com?
Oh yeah, just jamesprosek.com or troutsite.com. But there's a lot on there, but I'm putting up higher resolution images and redesigning the whole thing. So yeah, check that out in a couple months or now. I mean, if you want to see an outdated website, but I do usually post current stuff on Instagram. So like Wednesday, I'm giving a talk at the Westport Public Library in Westport, Connecticut, through the Aspetuck Land Trust, our local land trust, and I'll post stuff about the show in New York if people are in the New York area.
And I'm gonna channel a question that nobody's asked, but I know they're all thinking, which is, do you take commissions?
Yes, I do. Yes, I make my living selling artwork. So yeah, I do. I do commissions. I will warn people ahead of time. Sometimes it can take a while to complete them, but like I'm finishing a commission from 2017 right now, but but it only takes time because I want it to be good. So,
well,
but yes,
the easiest way to get a quick commission from James is invite him to your wedding and he shows up with a painting. So
that happens.
What?
Depends. I guess it depends on what you want. Yeah, if it's something pretty straightforward, then it shouldn't take too.
James, I can't thank you enough for coming to Masters of Fly tonight. It was a sincere pleasure. I mean, we're friends, but to have you come here and have Erik be able to interview you tonight has been like an incredible honor for us. So thank you so much.
Well, I really, Erik, it's been great getting to know you a little bit, and I hope we get on the water. And David, yes, we have known each other too long.
We have,
we've had some special moments on the water too.
We have. I'm just going to share one moment. You hadn't fished for a few years, and you came out to stay with me.
I hadn't fished for
out on the skiff, and we're at the end of Gardner's Island somewhere, and all of a sudden bluefish started feeding, and we had a competition to see who could catch the fewest fish. We were dragging the flies through the water, and we were doing it fast enough the bluefish couldn't grab them, and whoever caught a fish got penalized. And I'll never forget that. That was just
sometimes we do get silly on the water, but it was a beautiful day, and they were, yeah, I mean, when you can see fish in moving water just feeding, it's pretty remarkable. As
it was. So let me wrap up really quickly. James, thank you so much. Erik, as usual.
Thank both of you. It's really fun.
Yeah, and hang on, everybody, remember, if you write us, we'll send this to you. You'll get your own Masters of the Fly bumper sticker. You can stick it on your laptop or, on your fishing box or whatever. May 1st, we have the Guides Roundtable, which will have Merritt White, me, Gene Quigley, Abby Schuster. It's going to be a very lively conversation about fly fishing this year and what to expect. James brought up a very good thing about striped bass and their numbers and where they weren't in the 70s and 80s. And if we all write and make our voices heard for Amendment 7, we will not see those days come back again, but it's getting close. So please do that. And the Amendment 7 stuff has been posted. James, Erik.
Let's just remind everybody, Amendment 7 stuff is early. For those who are still online, it's one of the first posts in tonight's chat. It's on the mastersofthefly.com blog as well. Please, folks, take the trouble to read this, draft a letter, make sure it's individual enough not to be seen as a form letter, and let's make our voices heard.
Yeah, we just posted. And again, I want to thank all the attendees personally for coming tonight. Tonight was a wonderful thing. And we'll see you on May 1st. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you,
you,
James.
Thank you both so much. It was a lot of fun.
Great.